Hi everyone, so my name is Natalie and I'm going to be explaining neural transmission today and just how neurons are communicating. So neurons will relay messages throughout your body. They are powering all of your thoughts and your actions. Neurons communicate using both electrical and chemical signals, and the communication between neurons can be strengthened or even weakened by individual activities. So it could be affected, like if you exercise, obviously that would strengthen it. If you have a stressful day, that could affect the neuron communication, or drug use can affect neuron communication as well. So all of our perceptions and our thoughts and our behaviors come from the combinations of signals among neurons. And neurons will communicate with each other through dendrites and axons, which I am going to point out here as well. And we're going to go through each little block too. But let me point out the dendrites first. So you could see here that I'm zooming in. These are the dendrites, and I'm going to cover that a little more. The incoming signals are received at the dendrites, and the outgoing signals travel along the axon to the nerve. So this is the axon, and you can see that it would travel all the way down and it would end up here. Okay. So the dendrites are, as I pointed out here, they kind of look like tree branches in a sense. They are part of the postsynaptic neuron, and they receive the messages. So in this picture, you can see that here is another axon and it's connecting here. And that's because this is connecting to the dendrites. The dendrites will receive the messages. And this here is the soma. That is the cell body. Well, it's also known as the cell body, but it's a central area that's surrounded by the dendrites. So you can see all the little tree branches. And then this is the soma, the central part. The axon is the ascending end of the neuron. So here, and it goes all the way down, and it branches out. And then from there, you would reach the axon terminal. So this here, it's little, it's little branches too, and that would be the axon terminal, which pretty much just means the end of the axon. So you could see here in this picture where you have one coming in, the axon terminal, which is sending the messages, connects to the dendrite, which is receiving the messages. Whoops, sorry, my screen went black. Okay, and then we also have the axon hillock, which would be located here. And this is the specialized part of the soma that connects to the axon, and it controls the start of an electrical impulse. So it's based on the inputs of other neurons or its environments. The electrical part of the signal is called the action potential, and I'll discuss the action potential a little more in just a bit. And let me get to another screen here. Okay, so now I'm going to cover like just a little bit more in details of what is going on at the end of those, like when the dendrites and the axon terminal are meeting and sending the so the synapse would be the gap that separates the terminal from one neuron to the dendrite of another neuron. And so you can see that here. See how there's a gap. So this is the presynaptic neuron, and this is the postsynaptic neuron. And so these neurotransmitters are being released into the synaptic gap, which will then be received by the postsynaptic neuron, which is the receptor. Okay, and the this here is also the gap junction. So that is just kind of like it's the in-between. So it's made up of connexons, which are embedded in the cell membrane. So the neurons will touch each other and pass along a direct ion exchange that happened between two neurons. And that separation is called the gap junction. So I just wanted to cover that part real quick before heading back here. So inside the terminal, there are vesicles, and inside of those vesicles, there are neurotransmitters. So these little things here are the vesicles, these circles, and inside of those, if you could see the little tiny dots, those are the neurotransmitters. So when the signal from the axon goes all the way to the other end of the terminal and it releases the neurotransmitter into the gap called the synapse, then those molecules are attracted to the perfect shape that fits them, and that's called the receptors, which I mentioned here. These are the receptors, okay? So receptors are found on the postsynaptic neuron, which means they are the receiving neuron. And as I mentioned earlier, the ones that are receiving is the dendrites, those tree-like looking branches. So then the electrochemical process is responsible for dendrites and communicating with each other, and that means there is electricity and chemicals. And the chemicals are the neurotransmitters. They're sent along a synapse and they bind into the dendrite receptors and they cause a reaction to occur. So when one neuron is sending a signal across the axon, there is an exchange that happens across the axon between sodium and potassium. And so when there is an action potential, there's an exchange of neurons. So I mentioned earlier the action potential, and that is happening when there's that exchange between the sodium and potassium. So when there's not an action potential, it would be considered a resting potential. So in a resting potential, nothing is happening. Sorry, my screen keeps doing that. Nothing is happening. Usually they stay at a negative 70 voltage, and this happens when inside of the cell is more negatively charged than the outside. But pretty much they're resting, they're not doing anything, nothing's happening. Action potential is when something is happening. So when a cell is going to fire, they call it depolarization. So I'm going to go back to the other one to show you guys this. I'll probably use this here. And it kind of shows a little bit more as well, like the dendrites, the synapse, the electrical signals that would travel along the axon. So when a cell is going to fire, they call it depolarization, and it starts at the beginning of the axon. So to explain it, I mentioned that the normal average would be the 70 voltage MV. So when the threshold is met, it's usually at 55, and when that depolarization then starts occurring. So the channels will open up and the sodium rushes in, the potassium is going to exit out of that cell, and sodium channels will close, and then there is a decline in the voltage, and that will bring down the charge to get it back to the resting potential, which is where it does, eventually want to be. So maybe I should go back to this to show that. Okay. So the potassium channels will close and the sodium potassium pump will pump out the excess sodium and bring back in the potassium that it lost and bring it back to resting. So when these things are happening, these are like I said, they're all coming in, the transmitters. So sodium was going in, the potassium was pushed out, and then eventually they're going to, when they do the potassium pump, it will pump out the excess sodium. So I know we talked about depolarization, but now opposite of that is hyperpolarization, which is more negatively charged than resting. So it's going to be more negatively charged than that 70 MV that I mentioned. During the time of depolarization, that part of the axon is not going to do anything. So that means that if another stimulus were to come in and meet the threshold again, nothing is going to happen. It's called, and that's because there is something already happening. The depolarization is already happening. And so with the fact that nothing is going to happen during the same time frame, it's called absolute refractory period. So I'm going to go back to this here. Okay. And another one to mention is the all or none law. So once a potential begins, it travels all the way down the axon. So let's say the potential began, it's going to travel all the way down the axon and without losing speed or stopping. And if enough information is coming in, so in other words, if that depolarization had already started, and it's going to go all the way through because it has these myelin sheets that are protecting it. So it's just going to kind of skip right through. Here, these are the myelin sheets. And once it fires, it releases neurotransmitters, and nothing is going to stop it. Nothing. So it's going to make it all the way to the end here because it's already started its depolarization. And that is the all or none law. Just kind of explaining that. So the another thing to kind of cover is the inhibitory messages, and those are also known as hyperpolarization, which I mentioned earlier, which means that it's just more negatively charged than resting. The excitatory messages are also known as the depolarization, and you can find graded potentials in that area. So they're generated in the localized area where the excitatory or the inhibitory took place. So like I mentioned, those other words for that would be the hyperpolarization or depolarization. The release of neurotransmitters are called excitides, and these are chemical messengers that are released from this presynaptic neuron. So when calcium comes in, that's responsible for the excitides. The inotropic receptor is a receptor, and I believe I do have another picture for that one. Okay. I do not. Okay, but we'll cover spatial and temporal in just a second. But the inotropic receptor is a receptor connected directly to an ion channel, and the receptors that, when neurotransmitters bind them, the channels will open to allow ions to enter. So I know I do have an example of it. Give me 1 second. Let me find it here. Okay, I pulled it up. So this is a really good example. So these would be, this here is a ligand, and I might be saying the name wrong. And then this is the ion channel here. And so this is the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. And so the ionotropic receptor is the receptor connected directly to the ion channel. The receptors that when neurotransmitters bind them, the channels will open to allow ions to enter. And the ligand is the molecule that can bind to a receptor. So I kind of pointed that out to you there. There are several synapses having or a cumulative effect on the rate of an action potential, then that is called the spatial summation. And so it just pretty much means that a lot of different synapses are coming in, ions collected at once. And so it'll explain it here. See how there's a connection here, there's a connection here, and it's going into the one place. That's because different ions are coming into that spot. Now, the temporal is different. So the temporal is the cumulative effect of many signals in a short amount of time. One signal coming in across the dendrite and then another one, and there can be many channels over time, but you can see that it's just the one coming in, but there's several signals in that, and they're going to come in one at a time here. So after the neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, you have to clean up the synapse. And there's two ways to clean it up. One of them is the reuptake, and it will put back the neurotransmitters into the presynaptic neuron that were released. So it's kind of like recycling the neurotransmitters. There is another way to do it as well. That would be releasing enzymes, and then it sort of kills off the neurotransmitters. So these here, what'll happen, and like whatever's wasn't taken here will either be taken back into this here, or we're going to release some enzymes, and the enzymes will kill off the ones that were just kind of left there. But if they're taken back because they're just kind of stuck here, then that is called the reuptake. And that's just a little bit explaining about communicating of the neurons. Thank you so much for your time and for listening.